a piece in the economist.com. It's the case for optimism in South Africa after a lost decade. Economic prospects may be brightening, and we've seen that over the last while. The small but incremental changes to the macro economy that hopefully bleeds down to the micro economy. We're seeing economists, we're seeing business leaders saying we are seeing a change. But a few years ago, what was South Africa's biggest developmental challenge? And that was load shedding. But today, blackouts, they've eased. Our last bout of load shedding was in March last year. But according to some economists, something else has taken over load shedding as our biggest developmental challenge, and that's organized crime. It's taken over as our biggest threat to economic growth. Joining me now is Goolam Ballim, chief economist at Standard Bank. You quoted in that piece in The Economist, a case for optimism in South Africa. Let's start there. Do you see, as an economist that deals with a macro economy, do you see the small whispers of economic change in South Africa happening?
Lester, thanks for having me. I guess the organizing concept is macroeconomy, the word you just used. And yes, I would argue that in terms of the macroeconomic landscape, South Africa probably is at its best position in a decade in terms of the near-term cycle. And what I mean by that is quite simply, and without going on at great length, what we can enjoy is falling interest rates, strong wage growth, high asset prices as represented by the stock market, and of course an increasing credit cycle. So all of that does augur favorably for the economy in 2026. But there are some still very structural headwinds that plague our economy over the medium to long term.
And some of those structural crises that we face are crime, extortion, cartel activity. There is a concept called the Mexification. Not to denigrate one particular country, but usually used as a shorthand for the developmental challenges of many developing economies, particularly in Latin America. What is it that you're seeing in South Africa that mirror some of the developmental stumbling blocks in Latin America? Criminal cartels embedding themselves in the economy and the state.
Lester, perhaps a more neutral term to you, as you politely suggested, to identify one country. The phrase would be the rule of law. Now, the rule of law is everything. What I mean by that is the rule of law is the only reason an economy can achieve prosperity. In many respects, people are of the opinion that what drives an economy is capital and innovation. And by capital, we mean human capital, financial capital, and infrastructure. And when blended with the pixie dust of innovation, you get growth, and that is correct. However, capital and innovation, I would assert as a rule of thumb, account for 1/4 of economic growth. 3/4 of economic growth stem from the rule of law. So you've made plenty reference to, let's say, the broad crime landscape. But the rule of law is broader than that. It makes reference to general governance. So, for example, whether there is control on the executive, and that makes reference to politicians, the criminal justice system in its entirety, the revenue authority, investigative bodies, for example, and including the prosecutorial entity. So all of these institutions which give society its guardrails and ultimately enhance efficiency, better choices, and boost confidence is what gives thrust to economic growth. So the point of the article, and you quoted one of my submissions to The Economist magazine, was to say South Africa, at least for the last 10 years, has been plagued by a breakdown in the rule of law. And it's unsurprising that growth has been feeble and we've been going backwards in terms of per capita income. But the case for optimism, at least, if we look at the Madlanga Commission as one avenue, we seem to be at least putting a microscope and hopefully purging the crime elements, which I submit is going to be a daunting task.
You also reference what was a major operation in Brazil, Operação Lava Jato, Operation Car Wash, a massive investigation that exposed systemic corruption in Brazil. The current president, Lula da Silva, he was even convicted of corruption. The former president, Dilma Rousseff, was also investigation. It led to her impeachment. Michel Temer, also a former president. You have the leaders of major companies like Petrobras, Paulo Costa, also investigated. We have these commissions of inquiry at the moment. Does that go far enough? What would be a South African operation car wash? Is it doable? But of course, is there political will to do so? Is there independence in the investigative bodies to actually undertake such an operation?
Lester, so my reference to Operation Lava Jato in Brazil was to make 2 points. One is that when all of these revelations surrounding corruption between private sector firms and the state emerged, there was actually a plunge in consumer and business confidence in Brazil. In other words, people were aware that there was corruption, but news of it only added to their hesitation and confidence in society and the economy. The irony, though, is that the very news that was emerging that dented confidence was the beginning of some way going towards remediation, some way towards lessening corruption, not obliterating it entirely, but reducing and especially exposing corporate corruption in tandem with the state. So I'm making the point that what's coming out of the Matlanga Commission potentially can have a healing balm effect over time. In other words, while it's incredibly disturbing, and colloquially, especially the young people will say South Africa is a movie, these emergent news stories can serve as the beginning of a cleansing process, provided the president puts his back into instructing authorities or giving them the leeway to be able to purge individuals that have been alleged to have committed crimes. Admittedly, South Africans will always be a little cynical, justifiably, because if we look at previous commissions, there doesn't appear to have been remedy. So one worries about how deeply embedded criminal networks are. But if this is the beginning of some degree of purge, then maybe we may mirror Brazil in terms of incremental progress, if not complete cleansing.
Goolam Ballim, Chief Economist at Standard Bank, really appreciate your time.